All members having been recognized for opening statements. I did get him, I think. We now turn to our panel of witnesses, and I want to express appreciation to each of them for their appearance here this morning and for their participation in this conversation regarding universal service reform. Our panel consists of Mr. Steve Davis, Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Government Relations for Qwest, Mr. Joel Lubin, Vice President for Public Policy at AT&T, Mr. Ted Carlson, Chairman of the Board of United States Cellular Corporation, Mr. Mark Galey, Chairman of the Board of the Organization for the Promotion of Advancement of Small Telecommunications Companies, and a board member of the Western Telecommunications Alliance. He's also President and General Manager of TOA Communications. Mr. Derek Turner is Research Director at Free Press. Mr. Tom Talkey, a former member of this committee, is the Executive Vice President for Public Policy Affairs and Communications at Verizon. Mr. Tom Gerke is the Chief Executive Officer of Embark. Mr. Gregory Hale is speaking on behalf of the National Telecommunications Cooperative Association. He is General Manager of the Logan Telephone Cooperative. And Mr. Scott Wallstein is Vice President for Research and a Senior Fellow at the Technology Policy Institute. Without objection, all of your prepared written statements will be entered into the record, and we would welcome your oral summaries and ask that you keep those to approximately 5 minutes so that we have ample time for questions. Mr. Davis, we'll be pleased to hear from you first. And you might want to push the button on your microphone. We can hear you better.
Start over. Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Steve Davis, and I am Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Government Relations for Qwest. I appreciate the opportunity to share Qwest's views with you this morning on universal service. Before I address the universal service issues directly, I'd like to tell you a bit about Qwest and why we care so much about these issues. Qwest provides voice, data, internet, and video services nationwide and globally, and we provide local telephone service and broadband service in 14 western states.
Mr. Davis, let me ask that you pull that microphone just a bit closer. I think we can hear you better.
Okay, try
that. That's
that.
better, thank you.
Thank you. As of December 31st, 2008, Qwest provided 11.6 million voice-grade access lines and 2.8 million broadband lines to customers in our territory. And we currently have broadband available to 86% of our customer base. Our local service territory is very diverse. It includes urban areas like Denver, Seattle, Minneapolis, and Phoenix, but it also includes many smaller towns and cities and many rural communities with low household density. In fact, 42% of our 1,300 wire centers serving 2.2 million homes and businesses are located outside of metropolitan areas. We have 34 wire centers that serve areas comparable or larger than the size of Rhode Island. Needless to say, these are very sparsely populated areas. Although Qwest serves extremely rural areas in all of the 14 states in which we provide local service, we only receive high-cost federal universal service support in 4 states. Qwest receives no high-cost support in such rural states as North Dakota, Idaho, Iowa, New Mexico. In 2009, Qwest is projected to receive approximately 1% of the total $2.3 billion federal high-cost assistance. I'd like to commend Chairman Boucher for his longstanding recognition of the need for universal service reform and for holding this hearing to address these important issues. Qwest supported the proposed universal service reform bill of Chairman Boucher and Congressman Terry in the last Congress, and we look forward to continued efforts to accomplish significant universal service reform in this Congress. Currently, there are different mechanisms for distributing high-cost support to carriers depending on whether they are deemed rural or non-rural under the FCC's rules. And despite the massive rural territories served by Qwest, under the FCC's rules, we have been deemed a non-rural carrier and thus excluded from access to the vast majority of the federal high-cost assistance. Qwest and other non-rural carriers receive limited support under a mechanism that has twice been held invalid by the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. Yet this flawed system for distributing high-cost support remains in place. High-cost support should be based on the area served and not the size or identity of the carrier providing the service. Qwest agrees with the approach of Chairman Boucher and Congressman Terry's USF reform bill that high-cost support to non-rural carriers should be retargeted to individual wire centers. The purpose of high-cost support has been to enable telecommunications service in areas where it is not otherwise economic for a carrier to provide the service. It should not be used to support multiple carriers in an area where it is uneconomic for even one to provide service. Unfortunately, in many areas, the current high-cost support program does just that. High-cost support to duplicate network providers, primarily wireless carriers, has caused the enormous growth in the high-cost support fund in recent years. While high-cost support to incumbent carriers has been flat since 2003, support to these duplicative network providers has grown from approximately $17 million in 2001 to a projected $1.4 billion in 2009. In order to return the high-cost fund to its core principle of universal service, high-cost support for all carriers should be based on their costs of providing the supported services. As Chairman Boucher, Congressman Terry, and many others have recognized, it's also time to promote universal access to broadband through universal service support. Qwest currently offers broadband services to approximately 86% of the households in our region. However, in the absence of additional federal assistance, the necessary upgrades to expand our footprint are not economically feasible in many rural areas. The grants for broadband deployment established in the stimulus are a start, but are not sufficient to result in ubiquitous deployment of high-speed broadband. There remains a crucial role for universal service funding. Qwest believes that the primary purpose of any broadband deployment subsidization should be to aid construction of facilities in unserved areas. But high-cost support should not provide ongoing operational subsidies, nor should the support subsidize competition or build duplicate networks. In 2007, Qwest proposed a new federal universal service program that would provide one-time grants to selected applicants to deploy broadband to unserved areas, and we commend that proposal to the subcommittee for its consideration. Congress has an important opportunity here to structure an improved program for supporting universal access to basic telephone service and a new program for supporting universal access to broadband. Again, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today on these issues, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis. Mr. Lubin, we'll be pleased to hear from you.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, and members of the subcommittee for inviting me here today. AT&T is a longtime supporter of our national policy of universal service and of recent efforts to sustain that policy through meaningful reform. In this regard, we salute your leadership and the work of the entire committee. AT&T is the single largest provider of telephone service in rural America today. AT&T provides service to 7 million rural telephone customers. AT&T remains committed to serve our customers regardless of where they live and where they work. AT&T's unique experience serving a diverse set of customers has shown us the value of broadband services. Today, hearing is on point. The current universal service high-cost system is broken and will not create the proper incentives for broadband deployment in high-cost areas. Let me explain with a personal experience of mine that happened 5 years ago. 5 years ago, my daughter, son-in-law, came to us and said, "We've got some good news and bad news." I said, "Share the bad news first." They said, "Well, we live 6 miles away today. We're moving 6,000 miles tomorrow." I said, "What's the good news?" The good news is we'll be back in about 1 or 2 years, but I already got online, I have an apartment, I got a broadband connection, and did you ever hear about this thing called voice over the internet? I said, "Yes." They said, "Well, you know what? I can even keep the same local number." That was a big deal. That was a big deal for them because they didn't have to send out a number to everyone. It was a big deal for my wife and I because we could be in contact as a local call, speaking to our granddaughter virtually every day. Let me try to unpack what I just said. I call old technology, let's call that the narrowband local service that you know and you have today. That narrowband pipe is paid by a combination of local rate line items on a customer's bill, state and federal access charges paid by carriers that are then in turn recovered not from that particular customer, but from a host of customers, including that one who has the pipe. In addition, it recovers or paid by existing federal and state universal service funds. For this old technology to work, it is essential to know where the call originated and terminated. By the way, I'm going to describe a new technology where it just doesn't matter. The new technology, let's call it a broadband pipe, is paid directly by the end user. You will not need to know where the call, I actually should say packets, where the packets originate and terminate. Just like when my kids moved 6,000 miles away, I still dialed the same number, and lo and behold, it arrived, and we spoke. I'm sharing the story because it clearly shows that broadband technology is a disruptive technology. It simply redefines the game, including the local calling area, not just to be this small local calling area, but it redefines it to be, in effect, the whole USA, or in my example, the globe. In a broadband world, there are no access charges. There is no federal local service line charge on the bill. It also turns out that the broadband service offers much more capability to the customers. That's why we're talking about it. And I hope you see that it doesn't have the complexity of the old narrow band pipe, nor do I hope we ever take the baggage of the old technology and drive it into the new world. What a shame that would be. So, what to do? I'd like to identify three things because one needs to start thinking about a comprehensive solution to the dilemma. And the issue is, do I want broadband deployed? We'll talk about that shortly. But comprehensive reform needs to address three things. First, number one, we need to replace the existing collection mechanism from interstate retail revenues to a broader-based collection mechanism, which we would suggest telephone numbers or a combination of telephone numbers and connections, which is a more stable collection mechanism. Reform intercarrier compensation to preserve universal service during the transition to a fully deployed broadband world. And let me be very clear on this point. Access charges are going to vaporize. They're going to go away. They're not going to exist. And it's an issue that needs to be dealt with. Reform of the existing federal high-cost funding mechanism to promote deployment of next-generation broadband and expanded and improved wireless service in rural areas is important. I'd like to make one final point, and we need to clearly understand as we transition to the new world, this old world where you have very small local calling areas, and now I'm going to focus on a small rural calling area. That small rural calling area may have a local rate that's 40 to 50% lower than the urban rate, but yet the cost of that service in the rural areas could be 5, 10, 20 or more times greater than the cost in the urban area. I just observed that the local calling area of the old world is going to ultimately expand to be, in effect, the whole USA or maybe the globe. And the issue here ultimately is how do we reconcile these differences and create that comprehensive solution? My final point, remember, universal service funds and access charges didn't exist 25 years ago, 1984, and access charges won't exist in the broadband world. I look forward to your questions and working with you to find solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lubin. Mr. Carlson.
Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, and members.
And Mr. Carlson, please pull the microphone over. Get it very close. Turn it on. Thank you.
There we go. Sorry about that.
A little technology lecture here and there. Thank you.
I'm not an engineer. I'm sorry. Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, and members of the subcommittee, good morning. As you continue your review of the Universal Service Program, I've observed from my decades of experience in this business that there are several core principles that should guide the review of this important program. First, we must recognize...
Mr. Carlson, I hate to raise the issue, but I think your microphone's off.
No, it did go off there.
There we go. Good.
First, we must recognize that the money involved is not the government's, as one of you said, nor the telecommunications providers. It is the consumer's money. Second, collectively, government and the participating carriers must be superb stewards of these precious funds. Third, while progress has been made, there are still many areas of the country that are expensive to reach and serve with quality service, and without assistance will not be successfully served, and thus the program continues to be needed. And finally, that the core principles of competitive telecommunications for every American remains an important and worthy goal. Based upon these principles, I believe there are three questions for the committee to address. First, what is the proper role and scope of the Universal Service Program? One of you mentioned that. Second, what investments should be made in the future? And finally, how do you structure the program effectively and efficiently so as to maximize the benefits to consumers, as something you pointed out? As to the first question, I agree with the current law that the proper role of this program must be to ensure that high-cost areas have modern, high-quality telecommunications services that are reasonably comparable to those available in our urban and suburban centers and at reasonably comparable rates. Because if universal service were limited to a phone that was tethered to the kitchen wall, rural Americans would be denied access to the mobility tools that they need to compete with urban citizens, both here in the United States and abroad. And we commend your bill that you introduced in the prior session in that regard. With respect to the second question, there are two observations that I would offer. First, broadband services and mobile wireless services are two must-have functionalities that consumers expect and demand for personal and business use. Therefore, the program should be expanded to make broadband eligible for USF support. Second, however, significant additional investment is still required to bring high-quality mobile services to all Americans. Remaining committed to that investment in mobility will enable companies to bring essential economic development and public safety benefits to rural areas and through the network effect to all Americans. As a carrier that serves vast rural areas, I know that many Americans do not have sufficient access to high-quality mobile wireless services. My company's use of USF support has enabled us to extend service to literally hundreds of small communities that previously had no service or poor service. And we have made some huge coverage gains in places where we have been eligible for those funds, such as Oregon, Washington, and Maine. There's also much work still to be done extending and improving service in states represented on this committee, such as Virginia, Illinois, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Missouri, states where we have just recently been designated as an eligible telecommunications carrier. For those of you who represent rural districts or anyone who visits rural America, you know how your smartphone can stop working, or you've noticed how dropped calls and dead zones can increase when you leave heavily traveled roads. I believe a reform program can effectively and efficiently address these problems and, if tailored correctly, can be complementing the program that's just recently been authorized, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. To be clear, we now serve many rural areas that do not generate sufficient revenues to meet ongoing operations expenses and to maintain a high quality of service. There's no escaping the reality that the USF program is critically important to the viability of providing basic mobile services for millions of Americans. Some additional points that we'd like to see we make sure that goes into the legislation. From our standpoint, the legislation should not favor any class of carrier or technology, because by not doing so, we will foster innovation and competition. We believe we should look at a cost model rather than carrier's own costs, because a cost model would save significant cost and expense. And we believe that the legislation should reject any amendments that would foster a single market winner, for example, through reverse auctions, because a single market winner would relegate rural America to the days of a monopoly carrier, requiring enormous and unnecessary regulatory oversight to protect consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carlson. Mr. Galey.
Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today. I am Mark Galey, President and General Manager of Total Communications, located in Oshaleta, Oklahoma. Our family-owned company serves over 3,000 telephone subscribers and more than 1,000 DSL subscribers in sparsely populated areas of Oklahoma and Kansas. I come before you as Chairman of the Board of the Organization for the Promotion and Advancement of Small Telecommunications Companies and as a board member of the Western Telecommunications Alliance. The companies and cooperatives represented by these associations provide numerous services to their communities, including voice, broadband internet access, video, and wireless. The recent enactment of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 has brought more attention and focus than ever on the efforts to provide broadband to service to all citizens of our nation. The broadband infrastructure funding included in that law should further the goals set forth by Congress and the administration. However, as significant as that funding was, the funding levels were for broadband build-out, it will not get the entire job done. Nor will these grants and loans provide for the ongoing operations, maintenance, and upgrades of broadband networks. This brings me to the subject of today's hearing, the Federal Universal Service Fund. OPASCO and WTA believe very strongly that the Universal Service Fund high-cost program should explicitly support broadband. The goal of universal service policy has been to ensure that every American, regardless of a location, has access to affordable, high-quality access to the public switched network. For rural incumbent local exchange carriers, high-cost universal service support is a cost recovery program designed to promote investment in areas where it would not otherwise be feasible for carriers to provide quality service today or in the future. And the future of communications, as we know, is broadband. While the availability of broadband service is necessary, just as important is the adoption of broadband service. There are many factors that spur adoption of broadband. Computer availability and training come to mind, but the major factors are price and speed of the service, and USF plays a very important role in making broadband both affordable and attractive for consumers. Healthcare, education, and commerce have joined communications and entertainment as applications that now make high-speed broadband internet connection a necessity. USF needs other significant reforms. The USF contribution base must be expanded to include all broadband and voice connections, thus leading to smaller USF line items on consumers' bills and more funding availability. The so-called identical support rule should be eliminated, which would result in cost savings to the USF and prudent use of funds based on real investment levels of competitive carriers, not the investment levels of an incumbent carrier. OPASCO and WTA strongly believe that no cap should be imposed on the high-cost program or any portion of it, so that sufficient funds are available for ongoing broadband investment and upgrades. Continual investment is critical because broadband connections that are available today are not the networks that will enable rural areas and the rest of the country to compete globally 5 years from now. A high-quality broadband network can enable existing businesses in rural areas to grow as well as to attract new business to the areas, both of which will energize the local economy. We also request that the USF be permanently exempt from the Anti-Deficiency Act accounting standards. The imposition of the ADA on the USF or even the threat of such action brings about uncertainty regarding future USF payments that thwart investment in communications and network services. OPASCO and WTA also impose the implementation of reverse auctions, state grants, vouchers, and other mechanisms that will only diminish the usefulness of USF. Chairman Boucher, I wish to thank you and Congressman Terry for the insight and leadership you have shown on this issue. Introduced in the previous Congress, the Boucher-Terry USF reform legislation was supported by both OPASCO and WTA. Many of the reforms to USF that we requested in this testimony were contained in that bill. We look forward to working with you once again to move forward with progressive reform to this very important program. Now I would like to move to an important aspect of any USF reform effort, oversight and accountability. OPASCO and WTA pledged to work with Congress and the administration to continue the high-cost program's accountability to the public. On the issue of transparency and the operation of the USF, all parties involved must work toward realistic processes and fair solutions to better administer the funds collected from communications customers. In conclusion, for nearly 75 years, our nation has supported the policy of universal communication services for its citizens. Throughout those years, this meant telecommunications or voice service. Our country, our economy, and in fact, our entire world has vastly changed, and it is well past time to reform the USF. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Galey. Mr. Turner.
Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, Mr. Barton, and members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the important issue of high-cost reform. I'm the Research Director for Free Press, a public interest organization dedicated to public education and consumer advocacy on communications policy. Technology is rapidly changing the way Americans interact, learn, and do business, and all for the better. But the rules governing our communications markets are not keeping up with this rapid pace of change, and consumers are suffering as a result. When the current universal service regime was created in 1996, the Internet was an application that rode on top of the telephone infrastructure. Today, it's the opposite. Telephony is just one of many applications that ride on top of broadband infrastructure. With this convergence comes the opportunity to ensure universal affordable broadband access while also reducing the future burden on the fund. We strongly support the goals of universal service. Everyone benefits when rural consumers have access to affordable, high-quality communication services. But as advocates for the consumers whose monthly bills support the fund, we want to ensure that our system of universal service is both fair and efficient. Consumers in the 21st century marketplace should not be forced to subsidize a 20th century technology. We believe a bold and transformative shift in USF policy is needed. Done properly, we can bring affordable broadband to all Americans while also substantially reducing the size of the fund in the long term. Here's how. We must begin by asking two basic questions. How much money is each USF-supported line receiving each month? And is that support actually needed? Our research shows that 40% of the high-cost fund, nearly $2 billion annually, goes to subsidizing lines that receive less than $10 per month. This is also true for small rate of return carriers. 2/3 of these lines receive less than $10 per month in high-cost support. Now, these subsidies may be justified, but it begs the question, is this the best use of that $2 billion? We also should ask whether rates in these areas are already below the national average. And should we instead be using this money for broadband deployment to bring rural customers more than just a telephone line? The path to universal broadband and the ending of the over-reliance on subsidies begins with recognizing how convergence has changed the business of telecommunications. Before broadband, carriers were only able to earn perhaps $20 per customer each month selling local phone service. In today's converged world, a carrier can earn well over $100 on that same line by offering phone, TV, and Internet services. Unfortunately, our current regulatory structure does not account for this potential, ignoring that with this additional revenue, many high-cost carriers can operate profitably without ongoing subsidies. Instead, it tries to clumsily separate out regulated from unregulated costs and revenues and really results in overpayments and anti-competitive subsidies. As an alternative to this broken process, we suggest basing ongoing high-cost support on total revenue earning potential and forward-looking infrastructure costs calculated for each carrier on a granular, disaggregated basis. This modernized regulatory structure will reduce the need for ongoing support as many carriers will be able to recoup network costs and earn healthy profits from triple play services. However, for some carriers, the upfront cost for deploying broadband into currently unserved areas is just too high. Here is where we have the opportunity to turn the regulatory structure on its head. We should use the fund to pay these upfront costs and then only provide ongoing support where it is truly needed. We propose a 10-year transition where the new total cost potential revenue support model is phased in and the resulting cost savings are used to fund the build-out of open access broadband infrastructure into unserved areas. We estimate that after this transition, the total size of the high-cost fund could be reduced by 2/3 to less than $1.5 billion per year. Now, the $7 billion in broadband stimulus funds presents policymakers with a window of opportunity to transform USF. Here, a substantial portion of the upfront cost for rural networks may be financed by taxpayer dollars. The carriers operating these networks will thus have little capital cost to recover and therefore little need for ongoing support. But unless the FCC moves to modernize the regulatory structure, we may see double dipping. Now, by that I mean carriers might ask ratepayers to reimburse them for the networks already paid for by taxpayers. Now, getting universal service policy right isn't the only thing we need to do to ensure universal service. For rural carriers, the viability of the self-supporting triple play business model depends on getting fair rates and terms for transport and special access services and getting fair access to video programming. In closing, we urge Congress to maintain its commitment to universal service, but to do so with policies that are flexible and that benefit all consumers. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Talk. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Stearns and Ranking Member Barton. We appreciate the opportunity to to testify before this committee on this important issue. We've come a long way. Just a year ago, we were spending our time talking about the need for a capital fund to cover the upfront investment costs for broadband. And we were talking about the need to reform universal service in order to be able to ensure that it was focused on operational costs where necessary. We also talked about mapping in order to identify the areas of the country that were unserved so we could focus the money on the unserved areas. Well, now, a year later, the mapping legislation has been approved by the Congress. The capital funds are available through the stimulus package, and we're now back to looking at the Universal Service Fund. I think it is fair to say that there is consensus that the Universal Service Fund needs to be reformed. I'd offer 4 quick suggestions as to what you should focus on in this reform. First, cap the fund. The bottom line is that it's not that we're spending too little money. The problem is we aren't targeting the money we spend to the right places. And so the first effort is to try to force that retargeting of money to broadband and to mobile wireless services. To broadband and to mobile wireless services. Second, consumers want access not just to fixed services or wireline services, they want access to wireless services. And the Congress recognized that 10 years ago. But the bottom line is the mechanism for reimbursing mobile wireless carriers has been, well, it's frankly a travesty. Nobody any longer steps up and defends the identical support rule, which says that every wireless carrier that comes into the community gets the same amount of support as the underlying wireline carrier in that community. Nobody defends that anymore. Now the argument is over what is the new mechanism for giving support to wireless carriers. We strongly urge you to use a mechanism of reverse auctions or competitive bidding in order to enter into contracts with wireless carriers to provide service to unserved areas. You know, today, the reality of life is that we have 4, 5, 6, and in some cases more carriers receiving reimbursement to provide service to areas where many carriers are providing service without subsidy. There just is no rationale for this. So some say we should use a cost-based system for all of those carriers that want to provide service. The first question is, why do we want to subsidize all of these carriers? But the second question is, what is the practical reality of trying to implement a cost-based system? A cost-based system is a can of worms. Look, on the wireline side, you have infrastructure that is devoted to a single residence. And on the wireless side, you don't have that. On the wireline side, you have an accounting system that has been put in place for years to identify costs associated with that infrastructure that goes to the individual household. You don't have that on the wireless side. The bottom line is trying to impose a cost system on the wireless side is going to be a mess. So we encourage you to take a hard look at having some kind of reverse auction or some kind of competitive bidding as you do for other government contracts when you are in essence purchasing services. Third point, middle mile. This hasn't received much discussion, but when you look at the world of broadband, here's the reality. The cost of the last mile is high, but in many cases the cost of the middle mile from what we'll call the central office to the long-haul network is even greater per customer. We haven't paid much attention to this issue in the past, but as we look more closely at delivering broadband services to more rural areas, we have to look at that middle mile issue, and in my written testimony I'll offer some suggestions. Finally, we should pay into the fund on the basis of numbers. Last year, a broad coalition of players in this space filed with the FCC a numbers-based plan. I'm not saying it's the only plan, but I am saying a lot of work has been done, a lot of support has been developed from a broad coalition. It's simple, it's fair, and it's workable, and therefore it's something that should be considered. We look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, and all the members of the committee in your efforts to reform this important program.
Thank you very much, Mr. Talkey. Mr. Gerke.
Good morning, Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of my employer, Embark, a primarily rural provider of voice, internet, video, and other services. Reforming the Federal Universal Service Fund offers an opportunity to accelerate broadband deployment to customers in unserved areas while maintaining affordable access to critical voice connectivity. Embark commends Chairman Boucher and Congressman Terry on their introduction of H.R. 2054, the Universal Service Reform Act, which included a transition to a broadband-focused fund, a more targeted support mechanism, and appropriate carrier of last resort obligations, all critical elements of USF reform. We also commend Congressman Barton and Stearns on some of the key provisions in H.R. 6356, the Universal Service Reform, Accountability, and Efficiency Act, which sought to more precisely direct USF support to truly high-cost areas and tie USF support more directly to carrier of last resort obligations. Policymakers, stakeholders, and providers are increasingly coming to the conclusion that the Universal Service Fund is ready to enhance its mission by adding a focus on expanding and supporting broadband availability to all Americans. After all, broadband is increasingly an essential service. It's important in keeping people connected, enhancing public safety, enabling education and telemedicine, and creating jobs. Of course, there are important considerations in this effort, such as ensuring that the current mission of reliable, avoidable voice service from a carrier of last resort is not abandoned, and targeting USF support to places where the market would not otherwise deliver broadband. Incumbent phone providers have a very specific carrier of last resort mandate associated with universal service. To illustrate, we've brought a diagram today of a rural market in Goodland, Indiana. Each of the green dots here represent a household. As you can see, most of the households are clustered in a town center, and that's the most economical place to serve. But as a carrier of last resort, we're required to serve all of the outlying areas as well, where the cost to provide such service is much higher. In this case, costs are well over 10 times higher. The challenge here is how to layer on expanding the availability of broadband throughout low-density areas while maintaining the voice service that's critical. The policy of universal service was conceived to bring and maintain reliable, affordable service to places where the market forces alone would not otherwise provide it. The Universal Service Fund was created in 1996 because Congress realized that as competition emerged, service providers in high-cost rural areas would no longer be able to maintain the implicit urban-to-rural subsidies, and they would need to be replaced with explicit support in the form of the Universal Service Fund. The contemplated competition has become a reality. Under today's system, universal service support has been calculated and distributed on the basis of broad statewide geographic study areas, averaging together low and high-density areas that could be literally hundreds of miles apart. In closing, and to illustrate our concerns, let's take another look at the map of Goodland, Indiana. The average cost to serve the 452 households clustered in or near the town center is $19 per line per month. The remaining households are dispersed throughout the outlying areas, and the cost per line is $266 per month. With facts like these, here's what can happen. First, a dense area can knock out support for an extremely remote area. This is particularly egregious if the dense area is hundreds of miles away on the other side of the state. Second, without the carrier of last resort requirement, you run the risk of multiple carriers receiving unnecessary support to serve only the town center, creating duplication and waste. If you think about the situation like a donut in a hole, the answer is crystal clear. The hole will take care of itself. The purpose of Section 254 has always been to serve the donut. We look forward to working with you on USF reform to accomplish just that.
Thank you, Mr. Gerke. Mr. Hale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Stearns and subcommittee members, Thank you for the invitation to participate in today's discussion regarding the critical importance of the Universal Service Program and how best to strengthen it for the future. I serve as General Manager of Logan Telephone Cooperative in Auburn, Kentucky, and I also currently serve as the Region 3 Director on the board of the National Telecommunications Cooperative Association, NTCA. My remarks today are on behalf of Logan Telephone as well as NTCA and our 579 other members that serve rural areas throughout the nation. Organized as a cooperative, Logan Telephone's top priority has always been to provide every one of our customers, who are also our owners, with the very best telecommunications and customer service possible. We serve 5,961 customer lines across our 596 square mile service area, which adds up to about 10 customers per square mile. Rural is different. We have approximately 1,100 small rural counterparts in our industry who together serve 50% of the nation's landmass, yet less than 10% of the population. Rural Americans throughout the markets of NTCA members are enjoying universal telephone service, access to broadband internet services, access to advanced video services, and enhanced emergency preparedness. Now more than ever, our country's domestic, economic, and personal security needs are intricately linked to our National Universal Service Policy. American consumers and businesses are dramatically altering their communications expectations, and rural communication providers continue to respond to this challenge, but the fulfillment of our mission is not without tremendous cost. Universal Service plays an integral role in helping providers that are committed to serving the nation's economically challenging markets and consumers overcome these financial challenges. Clearly, our highest priority must center on strengthening and preserving the universal service policies. We also emphatically support proper oversight and accountability of the program, yet we do not believe this is occurring as is vividly detailed in a February 12th report from USAC, which I'm making available for inclusion in your hearing record. We believe it is crucial that we work together to again acknowledge the program's value in a way that restores America's communications preeminence. Our specific recommendations include the following. 1, include broadband in the definition of universal service and expand the contribution base to include all broadband service providers while retaining revenues as the basis for assessing contributions. 2, affirm that universal service support should focus on providing consumers with affordable and comparable services and not be used to stimulate competition. 3, allow universal service and intercarrier compensation reform to occur simultaneously by reducing or freezing access rates and allowing carriers to recover lost access revenues through supplemental ICLS or IAS support. And going along with that, we should require recipients of any new supplemental ICLS or IAS access cost recovery to voluntarily agree to Title II regulation of their broadband services and forego the retention of any excess earnings. During the transition from the public switch telephone network to a complete IP broadband network, we must require all providers of IP PSTN traffic, including interconnected VoIP traffic, to pay applicable universal service, access, and intercarrier compensation charges. We should require tandem switching rates and special access transport rates to be cost-based, strengthen the process for securing universal service eligibility or ETC status, eliminate the identical support rule and provide support based on a carrier's own cost, reject ideas to distribute support via auctions, vouchers, or any other untested means, allow the program to operate as envisioned by lifting program caps and freezes, and remove this private program from the federal budgeting process. Advanced communications services rely upon a healthy and robust network infrastructure. The biggest issue that must be resolved to ensure the existence of such a network is cost recovery. Without adequate cost recovery, there will be no network for any communication service to reach rural consumers, be it wireline, wireless, or other medium. We may well need to modify the program periodically, but the key is to have the network in existence and operational in the first place. We must invest in this critical infrastructure or be left behind by the world. The words of our new president ring true when we apply it to universal service. The challenges we face are real, they are serious, and they are many, but the members of NTCA are ready to meet these challenges to ensure that no one is left behind. Only through your help in maintaining a strong USF program will we be able to succeed. Mr. Chairman, we're excited to have someone with your knowledge of our industry and your commitment to rural America in a position to lead and develop policies that will ensure America's broadband and communications preeminence will shine once again. I thank you for your opportunity to speak here today, and I look forward to answering any questions from you or the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Hale. Mr. Walston.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify here today. The current Universal Service Program High Cost Fund is inefficient, inequitable, and growing at an alarming rate, especially because the program is funded by taxes on telecommunications services paid by all users, including low-income people, most of whom get no benefit from any part of the Universal Service Fund. The program is in urgent need of reform. The good news is that we have the tools to increase build-out, increase penetration, and reduce costs. We can do it by eliminating the current system and replacing it with competitive procurement. The current high-cost mechanism is not only expensive, but also discourages competition and does little to benefit consumers. A study by Gregory Rosted and Bradley Wimmer, for example, concluded that completely eliminating the high-cost fund would decrease telephone penetration by only about 0.5%. This result is consistent with nearly every other economic study published in peer-reviewed journals. Since then, the proliferation of wireless alternatives means that the effect on connections would probably be even less. The 1996 Telecommunications Act tried to address the competition problem by opening up the system to entrants, called Competitive Eligible Telecommunications Carriers, or CETCs. Some contend that we can control the growth by eliminating the rule under which CETCs receive the same subsidy as the incumbents. After all, they say, most of the increase in the fund is from subsidies to competitive entrants, most of which are wireless companies that have lower costs. That's partly correct. It makes no economic sense to pay entrants with lower costs the high subsidies that incumbents currently get. But it also makes no sense to subsidize a firm's high costs when a lower cost option is available. Thus, rather than eliminating the identical support rule, we should rewrite it so that all firms, including the incumbent, get the smallest, not the biggest, subsidy required for a firm to provide service. So, for example, if a wireless entrant can provide service in the area for only half the subsidy the incumbent receives, then all eligible carriers in the area, including the incumbent, should receive only that smaller subsidy. But we can do even better than that. An efficient program would provide just enough of a subsidy to make it profitable to provide the service. The problem is how to determine what that subsidy should be, or even whether a subsidy is really necessary. Fortunately, the government has a tried and true method for getting the biggest bang for its buck. When the government wants a good or a service, it asks for bids and generally awards the contract to the lowest bidder, all else equal. The government uses competitive bidding for buying products as simple as paper to those as complex as weapons systems like the Joint Strike Fighter. Everyone understands this concept and recognizes the importance of getting multiple bids, whether it's for work in your car or for providing services to the U.S. military in Iraq. This everyday common sense approach is sometimes called a reverse auction. Universal service is just another type of government procurement. In this case, the government is buying some minimum set of telecommunications services that society believes everyone should have at a specific price. The current system, however, is akin to awarding no-bid contracts that last forever. We know that no-bid contracts are more costly and less transparent than our contracts awarded in a more open and competitive manner. For that reason, we generally don't tolerate no-bid contracts, yet they've become so accepted in universal service that anything else is considered radical. But there's no reason for the no-bid perpetual contract approach to continue. The high-cost fund could begin procuring universal service using the same competitive bidding approach that the government uses for almost everything else. In a reverse auction for universal service, firms tell the government how much of a subsidy they would need to provide particular telecom services in particular areas. The government then chooses the firm that can provide the service for the smallest subsidy. Reverse auctions are not a new idea. Aside from the government using them for nearly all procurement, other countries have already tried using this method, have already used this method to provide telecommunication services in rural areas. This experience, which I review in a paper forthcoming in the Federal Communications Law Journal and that I'm submitting as part of my testimony, has important lessons. In particular, reverse auctions for universal service are feasible and typically lead to much smaller subsidies than the incumbent beneficiaries previously said was necessary, thus using less taxpayer money to provide more services. In some cases, the auctions revealed that firms were willing to provide service with no subsidy at all. And the very worst outcome from using reverse auctions was one that ended up with the incumbents winning everything. In other words, the worst outcome from using reverse auctions in universal service was what we accept as the status quo today. I do not, however, want to give the impression that just because reverse auctions are feasible, they would be easy. The details of the auction matter a lot. For example, would you want to allow multiple winners in any given area? Allowing multiple winners would facilitate service competition, but could actually increase universal service obligations, at least in the short run. Another issue is how to handle the incumbent. On the one hand, the incumbent may have an advantage in an auction because it already has facilities in the area, potentially discouraging other firms from bidding. On the other hand, if the incumbent loses, could it or should it still be the carrier of last resort? These problems, however, can be solved. Auctions for spectrum, too, were once widely considered impractical. Yet the FCC successfully implemented spectrum auctions, and they are now used routinely around the world. Moving from no-bid perpetual contracts to competitive bidding for universal service provision would help bring the high-cost fund under control. Reducing the high-cost fund would, in turn, go a long way towards facilitating an efficient and fair universal service program. Thank you. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walston, and thanks to all of our witnesses for their testimony here this morning.